There we go. Okay, I'm going to give it a couple of, I'm just going to give it a minute quickly and let attendees join. Okay, great. So thanks everybody for being here again. Today we've got paper, so we're gonna have Yusuf Mercan is gonna be presenting first, and then Randy Wright, and then Francesco Lippi. So our presenters have got half an hour to present the paper. Then we have like 15 minutes of discussion. If you have like a substantive question, feel free to ask it in the Q&A and we'll come back to it later. There's co-authors on hand to answer kind of clarifying questions in the Q&A. During the discussion section, if you have a question, also you can raise your hand. I'll come around to people, unmute them, and then we can go through questions. Okay, so I'll now throw it over to Yusuf. Thanks for being here. I know it's late over in Melbourne.
Okay, I am sharing my screen and full screen. So am I good to go?
Yep, good to go. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. Good morning to you guys from Melbourne. I guess Simon is also in Australia. So thank you for putting us on the program. So my co-authors, Serdar, Fatih, and Kurt are in the audience. So they might also answer some questions you might have. So let me just jump in. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have introduced various degrees of containment measures to sort of contain the spread of the pandemic on humans. And so this resulted in a massive dislocation in the labor markets around the world. And this dislocation basically risks destroying long-term employment relationships that are built over many years. And to the extent that these employment relationships come with sort of know-how that is accumulated over time, any policy might have large and persistent impacts on earnings, productivity, inflation down the line following the recovery. So we think of, I mean, of course, on top of the containment policies, governments also enacted labor market policies to help out workers and maybe save these valuable matches. And we think of such policies in two broad categories. So it could be in the form of unemployment insurance, quote unquote, these policies are helping workers directly, or those policies could be in the form of payroll subsidies that are helping workers through firms targeting to preserve matches. So we have we're interested in three broad questions. What are the differential effects of like containment policies and labor market policies on infection dynamics and the labor market? What are the welfare consequences of adopting such policies, and how these policies might interact? So this third question to us is the most exciting one, but for now, this is pretty much work in progress. We'll have some things to say about it, but not too much at this point. Okay, so let me be a bit more specific about what we do. So we propose a framework that combines a two-sector labor search model with a basic epidemiological model. So as in many papers now, infection dynamics are going to be endogenous to economic activity. In this particular case, it's going to be endogenous to what's going on in the labor market. We're going to have match-specific human capital. So workers will learn by doing. Over time, this match capital will accumulate. We're going to introduce recall options. So workers could be recalled to their previous matches upon layoffs. We're going to introduce financial frictions and sticky wages that result in possibly inefficient separations. We're going to take this model, we're going to calibrate it to the pre-COVID US labor market and use the model as a measurement tool then to evaluate containment and labor market policies. In particular, we're going to be comparing two cost equivalent policies and look at their positive implications and normative implications. Okay, so before I preview what we find, I want to sort of present the contribution of this framework. So the key innovation, as we think of it, is of this model, is that it allows us to study interactions between different policies. So you could think of a country where UI policy is pretty generous, right? Think of Northern European countries. The question is, if this country has a certain amount of resources to fight the economic impacts of the pandemic, what should that country do? Should it increase UI even further, or should it maybe do something else? How does the answer to this question change if this is a country like the US, where maybe UI is relatively less generous? So so basically, what does the optimal policy involve? Is it a mix, or is it one or the other? These are the questions that we can answer. Of course, the answers to these questions might depend on the level or the aggressiveness of containment policies. Our framework also allows to do that. So we have a unified framework that that we can use, and we think of these issues as first-order policy questions. So today we're going to present a first sort of attempt to tackle some of these questions in this spirit. Okay, what do we find? We find that a generous UI program or UI extensions during the pandemic or an epidemic is effective in containing the virus. But this comes at the expense of a large decline in economic activity, destruction of match capital, and persistently low productivity during the recovery. On the other hand, payroll subsidies are very effective in preventing productivity from collapsing, but this comes at the expense of keeping workers working at risk of infection and more deaths. From a welfare point of view, among these two policies that are cost-wise equivalent, we find that payroll subsidies are preferred. But we also acknowledge that this ranking depends on the success of other concurrent policies that might be out there. So we're going to have like one maybe simple exercise to point this out, and we're going to show that if recalls become more pervasive during the recovery, actually this ranking is reversed and UI becomes preferred over payroll subsidies. Okay, let me move on to the model. So the model has two blocks. The first block is sort of a search block, and the second block is a simple SIR block, and these two blocks interact. Okay, so we have two sectors. We have an essential sector and a non-essential sector denoted by S. And agents in this economy are heterogeneous among multiple dimensions. In particular, firms could be matched and they could be producing, they could be vacant with a possibility of recalling a worker, or they could be vacant and maybe advertising a vacancy to start a match from scratch. Households have different employment statuses, different health states, match-specific productivity and wages that depend on their employment history. So these firms and workers meet in a labor market subject to search frictions. Important features, we have recalls, as I pointed out. Some unemployed workers may be recalled, preserving their match capital. This is valuable to the firm precisely because they produce at the same productivity level as before the temporary separations. It's valuable to the worker because they preserve their wages. And we introduce financial frictions. Some of the firms in the non-essential sector will be subject to such frictions where they have to run profits above a certain threshold. Okay, so the second block is the simple SIR block. I guess this is familiar to almost everyone by now. We have susceptible, infected, and recovered people. And the infection probability depends on a random component that is common to all susceptible workers in the economy, but also there is a separate component that affects workers that are supplying labor. So this block is pretty much following Eichenbaum, Trabant, and Rebello and Trabant, basically. So we're going to assume that in steady state, there's no infection. So everyone is susceptible, nothing goes on. Okay, let's go into the details. Households have different health states. They could be susceptible, infected, or recovered. And this health will evolve according to the SEER block that I just pointed out briefly. Workers can be employed on temporary layoff, permanent layoff, denoted by W, UT, and UP. Their output from a match with a firm depends on their health and their match-specific productivity. This match-specific productivity takes on specific values on a discrete grid on from Z0 to Zn. And match output has this particular form. So we assume that, if you have a higher match productivity, you produce more output. If you're infected, you're less productive, so your output goes down. Susceptible and infected workers are equally productive. So all new matches from the lowest possible productivity Z0, and as they keep producing, they improve stochastically over the life of a match. Consumers are hand to mouth, so this is a simplifying assumption. They will consume W, their wages when employed. They will consume their unemployment benefits when they are unemployed. And we allow workers to terminate their matches if surplus turns negative. Firms, similar. Firms could be vacant, waiting to match with a new worker. They could be waiting to recall their furloughed worker, or they could be producing. They could also decide to dissolve the match if surplus turns negative. They could recall their workers at a rate R if they have the option to do so. And this option disappears either when a worker finds a new match at rate f of theta, which I'll talk in a minute, and or if the option just disappears for exogenous reasons at rate chi r. And non-essential firms are subject to financial constraints, and these constraints lead to temporary separations. Labor market is standard, it's DMP, so I won't go into too much details. It's just the contact rates are given by a matching function, which depends on market tightness in each sector. So the sectors in this case are segmented. Wages follow a piece rate contract. Workers capture a share phi of their output, but we assume that wages are downward rigid. So if susceptible workers become infected, we assume that their wages stay the same. So wages can go up, but they don't go down with health status. To summarize, there are two types of separations in the model. Permanent separations, if either party's surplus turns negative, or temporary separations, if an exogenous separation shock delta hits or the financial constraint binds for the firms that are relevant for that constraint. Okay, what are the government policies here? The government, before the epidemic, runs a certain level of UI benefits. During the epidemic, the government can introduce two types of policies. First is a containment policy. We think of that as a tax rate, tau Q, on output. The second type is fiscal policies intervening in the labor market. The government can increase the generosity of UI, so increasing the level of P, or it could introduce a payroll subsidy tau P, which is the fraction of wages paid by the government. So basically this reduces the cost of employment to firms. We don't have a government budget, so the budget will not balance, but when comparing these policies, we'll look at cost equivalent policies. Okay, let me go into the recursive problems of the firms and the workers. So employed household who has some certain health status, age, matched with a firm that has a certain constraint type. So right now I'm just looking at non-essential sector value functions. And the worker has a certain productivity Z that has been formed over time. The worker consumes her wage. The continuation value depends on how health evolves. Again, this health depends on whether the worker is working or not. In this case, it's basically given by this indicator one. So an unemployed guy is more likely to be infected. With delta, you separate, you have the option to be recalled, so you're on temporary recall. This max operator captures the assumption that wages do not go down, but they can increase, so this is the downward stickiness in wages. The continuation value is given by W tilde, so the value of being employed at the end of a period is as follows. So if the financial constraint does not bind, the worker can decide whether to permanently separate or not. It's given by this D indicator, in which case the worker is permanently separated from the match. If the constraint binds, we assume that the worker has the option to be recalled further down the line. How does that constraint look like? We basically model it in a very simple fashion. It is modeled, so we require the firm to run a certain profit level above a threshold. So if this condition holds, so profits net of containment taxes and payroll subsidies, then the firm is constrained and has to terminate the match temporarily. By definition, for the unconstrained firms, this is a redundant constraint. So this is just to keep the notation general. Okay, for the unemployed people of a certain health type H, which has the option to be recalled, the worker consumes her unemployment benefits. Continuation depends on how the health evolves. Now, this basically takes into account the fact that the worker is not supplying labor. So if the recall option does not disappear, the worker basically can do three things. If the worker matches with a new firm, the worker starts from the lowest productivity possible with a new wage that is reset. If the worker is recalled at the rate R that is exogenous, it has the option next period to produce with its old productivity level and its old wage, her old wage. With the complementary probability, you continue as before. In case the option expires, basically this is pretty much the same. Importantly though, for new matches, we have to take into account that the new match could be a firm with a firm that is constrained or not, and we assume that's determined exogenously. So a certain share omega of matches are with constrained firms, and 1 minus omega is with unconstrained firms. I guess in the interest of time, I will skip over how the value functions for the firms look like, but these basically mirror what the value functions for the workers look like. But maybe I could briefly look at what an idle firm does with an option to recall. Here, this has positive value, basically, and as long as the option continues, the firm basically tracks what's going on with a worker, and with a certain probability R, the firm can basically go back to production. So we have free entry for new matches, which is pretty standard, that drives down to the value to 0, basically. So far I've been just talking about non-essential the non-essential sector. The essential sector is similar. It's just that we don't have financial constraints in the essential sector. So workers can be temporarily laid off only when there are exogenous separation shocks. And the containment policy does not apply to the essential sector. Those are the assumptions that distinguish the sector from the non-essential one. Okay, the calibration, many parameters are standard, so I don't want to spend too much time on these. So the parameters regarding the CIR component are mostly borrowed from Eichenbaum, Rebea, and Trabant. I guess I'll skip those. The more interesting ones are the ones that we internally calibrate. So as I pointed out, match capital is important for us. So we try to discipline how important that is. And to get at that, we target basically the P90 to 10 ratio of the earnings distribution. So the speed of productivity improvements helps us get that. And also we have a CRA utility function, and we have death. So we follow Hall and Jones and add a fixed shifter into the utility function that gives us a certain statistical value of life. So this is 10 million, which is on the higher end of the estimates in the literature as far as we understand the literature. Okay, so let me spend the final 10 minutes, I think I have 10 minutes left, with the experiments that we run. Okay, we start with a baseline experiment. What does it look like? So the economy in time period 0 is in steady state, and the financial constraints do not bind in any of this, in the non-essential sector for any of the firms. In period 2, multiple things happen. First, exogenously, a certain mass of I1 workers in the economy become infected. At the same time, the government starts implementing a containment policy, and that containment policy is in the shape of an output tax, TAUQ. This is in place for 13 weeks, so like 3 months. At the same time, the financial constraints tighten up for the same duration. So far, we're not looking at any labor market policies yet. Well, I'll get to that. And we pick these a lower bar, and tau Q such that at the peak, unemployment rate hits 25%. And we pick the composition of these two such that the two contribute roughly the same to this final unemployment number. So as time goes by, the epidemic eventually dies out, and we study perfect foresight transition dynamics. Okay, how does the model behave? I'll start with simple graphs. So looking at the unemployment rate, I mean, as targeted, the average unemployment rate in the economy hits around 25% at the peak. And as the containment policy is lifted, unemployment starts recovering. My mouse is too sensitive. I'm sorry about these jumps. And mostly this is driven by the huge increase in unemployment in the non-essential sector. Because the essential sector, remember, is not subject to the containment policy or the financial constraints. I guess these graphs also are by now very familiar to many of you. So first, I guess we get similar graphs, and you see that in this baseline economy, we get to around 0.4% of the population ending up dead at the end of the pandemic. Okay, so let's look at what happens to output, productivity. So this is the average labor productivity in the economy as a percent deviation from steady state. So when the pandemic starts and the containment policies are put in place, we have a huge spike in average labor productivity. This is driven purely by selection. The very lower, the lowest match productivities basically are destroyed endogenously. But as the containment policies are lifted and as new matches start to form, this average labor productivity goes down, crosses below its steady state level, and basically, as you see, even after 2 years, it's still below its steady state. So you see already a huge, a persistent decline in average labor productivity. So to understand the dynamics of that a bit, let's look at the share of recalls in all of UE flows. So during the containment policy, all job finders are recalled. So there are no new matches formed. So that's why you get 100%. And then when the policy is lifted, new matches start to be formed. So we have a change in the composition of new jobs versus recalled jobs. And as the composition shifts towards permanently separated workers, this share undershoots and then recovers over time. Okay, so the policy experiments. So now we want to study the effectiveness of payroll subsidies and raising UI generosity. What do we do specifically? We start by increasing the generosity of UI for 13 weeks during the containment policies are in effect. We get that number basically this 2.5-fold increase from numbers motivated by the CARES Act. On average, UI payments increased from $400 per week to $1,000. So we just multiply B by 2.5. We compute the present discounted value of the cost of these additional UI payments to the government. And we also solve for a policy tau P such that it has the same cost as the UI policy, and it ends up being this number. So we're going to be comparing these two policies that are cost equivalent to the government. We're going to, for now, study these two things in isolation. Of course, I mean, we acknowledge that the complementarities are very interesting and very exciting for us to do. Okay, similar graphs, unemployment rate, baseline gets us to 25% again. This is what we had before. UI basically now allows workers to quit easily. So unemployment rate increases a lot to 35% almost. Payroll subsidies are basically keeping these matches intact, and in fact, it's actually keeping economic activity going. So unemployment is still, it does not go up as much as before. But you see the clear trade-off between these between these policies related to health. So the payroll subsidy results in more deaths than the UI policy. And to give you, I guess, two numbers, compared to the baseline, the UI policy has around 1% fewer deaths. The payroll subsidy is around 3.7% more dead, again, compared to the baseline. So looking at average labor productivity, so here we conclude that by preserving matches and preserving economic activity, this payroll subsidy actually prevents the productivity to collapse. And so the recovery basically is pretty quick in terms of productivity. This is driven by basically matches not being destroyed to begin with, and also that workers are recalled at a higher share than before. And I also, just to fix, look how strong this match capital in our model is, I am zooming out and plotting average labor productivity and consumption per capita for 1,000 periods, and you see that the convergence isn't complete even by the time we hit 1,000 periods. So this match capital is pretty important in our model. Okay, what do these two policies imply for welfare? So remember, UI saves lives at the expense of unemployment and destruction of match capital. And as we saw, that results in a very persistent and sluggish recovery. A persistent decline in productivity and a sluggish recovery. Payroll subsidy saves jobs, but at the expense of lives. So we basically compute the consumption equivalent welfare relative to the baseline for both, accounting for the transition path. It turns out that the consumption equivalent number for UI is like 0.33%. For payroll subsidies, it's 1.7%. So payroll subsidies dominate in this case. So here, I guess I'll be a bit more courageous. So ideally, we want to compare the positive and normative implications of policy interactions. Look at how these welfare implications change with the aggressiveness of the containment policy, the duration of it. So there are many things that we want to look at. But for now, to give you a sense, what we do is something simple. We basically following so during the recovery period, we basically increase the recall rate R, which we think of as a stand-in for another policy that keeps firms in business. And we compute the welfare gains for payroll and UI policies for these different levels of R. So this is, I guess, a bit hard to read off, but when so this is the baseline R level, our steady state calibration. When we quadruple it, the recovery in unemployment is faster. But more importantly, when we look at the numbers, the welfare gains from payroll subsidies start to decrease, and at this R level, it flips. So at this high R level, unemployment insurance ends up dominating payroll subsidies. So this is to say that we acknowledge the fact that this ranking depends on a lot of other stuff that we're trying to explore down the line. Okay, I think it's time to conclude. So I presented a model of long-lasting employment relationships that interact with epidemic dynamics. We compared UI and payroll subsidies. We found that payroll subsidies dominate UI, but this ranking depends on basically a bunch of other stuff that we're going to explore, and we just gave one example. And I guess I want to acknowledge some caveats that this health statuses are basically perfectly known by everyone in the economy. There's no reallocation between the essential and the non-essential sectors, no age composition, I mean, clearly. And then, again, our calibration exercise is preliminary. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you so much. I hope I'm on time.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Yusuf. Okay, so if people have questions, feel free to raise your hands. We've got a few from the Q&A, and I'll come back to them in a sec. So in a second, I'll come back to Ben and Randy. I had a couple of quick questions. So just quickly, so it seems like whether on balance the payroll subsidy or UI does better, it's going to depend a bit on how large this financial constraint effect is, or how tight this financial constraint becomes. I'd imagine a payroll subsidy is going to perform a lot better if the shock is mostly the tightening of the financial constraint. So I was just trying to figure out again how did you guys calibrate the tightening of the financial constraint versus the other shocks?
So we basically fixed those numbers so that in the baseline, 12.5% of unemployment basically is due to the increase in is due to the containment policy, and the rest is basically generated by the tightening of the financial constraint.
So I guess in the day, so I guess I was going to ask, like,
so Fatih, I think.
Oh yes, go ahead.
Wanted to pitch in, I think.
Just wanted to add one thing. There's two things about financial constraints in this model. First is what fraction of firms in the non-essential sector are subject to that constraint, and the second is how big is the tightening during COVID. So the first one we think we have a good idea of how to do that. The second one we don't. So the first one, there's a bunch of surveys. The New York Fed has done one. There's other surveys, where firms were interviewed about how much cash they have, if they didn't have any revenues, how long they could last. So you can get a distribution of what fraction of firms couldn't last more than a couple of weeks. So that's what we use to pin down the fraction of firms that are constrained. Now, how tight does the constraint get? That's where we're having a bit more trouble. So we have two sources for the increase in uncertainty in unemployment. And you're absolutely right. It's kind of critical how important the financial friction is. we have some results where if it's not due to financial frictions, actually the policy results could be different. So
Right.
we're
Yeah,
open
that's what I
to
kind of imagined.
Yeah. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So we're thinking of ways of how to discipline that, but for now, we just for the sake of honesty, what we did is, let's say we have two reasons for why unemployment goes up in the baseline. One is the containment, so revenues fall, and then the other is the financial friction, and the two obviously interact. So let's make sure that the two roughly contribute, half and half. But that's just, that's a number that we just came up with without too much discipline. So if anybody has any comments on that, we obviously would be very, very happy to hear that.
Right. Yeah. No, what you're doing seems to make sense. It's just hard to figure out how best to do that, because it kind of seems crucial. Okay, so I might go. So Ben, let me find Ben over here. Oh, have I lost Ben? Oops, sorry. I gotta do this in attendees. So Ben, I think, had a couple of questions. Ben, if you wanted to unmute yourself, feel free to ask. Ben, are you there? Okay, I might come back. Oh. Sorry, I just muted you again.
Okay, great. Thanks. Super interesting. I'll ask my last question, which is, when it comes to the death effects, my hunch would be that how people think about the short-term work is often that you're not productive. Hence, you might end up thinking of the pie for the formerly employed. I guess Kurt answered the question as being idle. My other hunch was about targeting of the payroll subsidies. In practice, I guess there's one way to target the payroll subsidies in a way that they take advantage of adverse or non-adverse selection and saying, well, you can only get the payroll subsidy, as with short-term work policies, if you actually make the worker idle. Maybe you'll end up selecting exactly the firms that otherwise would go bankrupt, making the payroll subsidy dramatically better targeted, not essentially giving it to the informational firms that would be continuing producing anyway. That's my two last thoughts. Thanks.
In fact, I guess one thing we're introducing into the model is precisely that we're going to allow firms to pause production while keeping the match intact. So you don't produce, so you're subsidized for keeping the worker. So that's on our list, and one of the things that will be done, I guess, right after this. So, but you're absolutely right that matters.
And you call it a payroll subsidy. It could also just be a subsidy. Is that right? It doesn't have to be proportionate to payroll. It can just be it could be a loan, perhaps. It could be just a lump sum transfer to firms.
Yeah, I mean, right. I think, yeah, we have the flexibility to change many things. We can change the operating costs, right?
Yeah. So right now, there's some modeling choices that we had to make, and we have a couple of options that we're still working on. But you can imagine that the payroll subsidy has kind of two effects. One is that it relaxes the financial constraint because it obviously helps with the per period profits. But the second is it maybe just allow, and then you can make it conditional on work, so that you undo this negative effect on debts that come from that. So the way we've modeled it just enters into the financial constraint and doesn't distort the decision of active employment. So even if we have decision to remain active and produce versus to be on pause, that wouldn't matter. But obviously there's an alternative modeling where you can do that. And then your second question, we thought of payroll subsidy as just some fraction of your wage, but you can think of these other loan programs, cheap loan programs that also sometimes come with an option that it's forgiven, and that would be basically a subsidy for for the fixed cost, and that would also help with the with the financial friction. So that policy we don't have it yet.
It might be a free policy if it's a loan, unless there's some externalities where the individual decisions of the firm, such that the value stays positive, might not. Super interesting. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Right. Just to add to that quickly, I think there's a lot of sort of other conditions that can be imposed on these payroll subsidies. I mean, one thing is what Ben sort of mentioned, having people sort of stay at home while remaining matched. But there are other conditions that include, say, requiring these firms to preserve these matches, as we can see in some other policies in other countries. And I guess there's a trade-off there. I mean, for firms, maybe if the payroll subsidies aren't generous enough, then take-up rate for that particular option will be low. If forcing them to remain matched and pay, suppose, their operating costs throughout the pandemic would be more costly to them. So yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot to be done on potentially modifying the way these payroll subsidies take shape.
I'm going to go to, I'm not sure if his questions were answering the thing, but Randy, did you want to add anything, or do you have a question that was outstanding? I should have Can
you hear me now?
Yep, gotcha.
Well, I typed some questions, but they can read those later. I have a couple of minor comments meant to be constructive. First off, in these subsidies, I agree they're not payroll subsidies, they're just subsidies or transfers to the firm. And as an analogy to banking crises, there's a big important distinction whether a bank is illiquid or insolvent. You might want to bail out the illiquid ones, but you don't want to prop up the insolvent ones. And it may be difficult, but giving lump sum subsidies or transfers to all these firms, I mean, one thing a recession does is it has a cleansing effect. You might want to weed out some of these bad firms. So if we could target these subsidies, it might be productive, but possibly difficult. In terms of style of presentation, I have two comments, again, meant to be constructive. I might have missed this, but I think your sticky wage version is your baseline model. I think you're obligated to report a flexible wage version of this. I'd like to know what fraction of your results are coming from this Keynesian assumption, and what fraction of the results are coming from other frictions in the model. Finally, I don't know if you like this, but there's a facade of legitimacy to calibration, especially in labor. For example, when you say the expiration rate for a recall is 1/26, and you cite Fujita and Mascarini, I mean, they just made that up. And even going back to your Hagen-Ormanovsky citation, the modern calibration method is to set parameters to match moments, not to match the literature. So some of these moments are going to be hard to match, including in the data, including the death probability. But for most of the standard parameters, we should be matching moments in the data, and again, not in the literature.
So I think we take the constructive comments. Thank you so much. With flexible wages, yes. So we could introduce that. I mean, we think of these. Some of these are basically, exogenous parameters that map directly into their empirical counterparts. Some, we just don't know enough, and so we borrow them from the literature. So it's a mix, but we try to do our best. Specifically the Fujita Mascarini paper, I guess they show that recalls basically after 6 months become basically non-existent. We just took it from them. I don't know if they made it up or not, honestly.
Neither do I, but I made up the fact that they made it up. But it's meant to be an example.
To be fair, Randy, we try to be consistent in what we do. So when we say we take this from this paper, what we really mean is we adopt their strategy for calibration. We don't necessarily need
Good. That's the way it should be presented in the tables and the slides. That's the right way to present it.
Whatever is their strategy, whatever target they have, we try to do the same target. In some cases, that ends up giving exactly the same number. In some cases it doesn't. So we'll next time we present, we'll make sure to note that. Thank you.
I'm just going to really quickly follow up. I think is the question of Ben's in the chat. So just to be clear, with the recall option, you always want to put a worker on recall. Is that right? I mean, I guess if you so so the recall really kicks in when like my productivity falls, I can't lower the wage, or the financial constraint binds. One of those two things. And then I always want to put the worker on recall. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes, recall would be always preferred to a new match.
Right. And so how do you guys think of, is the modeling of the kind of the exogenous rate R, is that from Fujita? Is that how Fujita and Moscarini do it as well? I forget.
So so I mean, their modeling choice is a bit different. So in our case, it's a parameter, but we pick that so this is internally calibrated. So this is what the model gives us. We target basically this 40% share of recalls among all UE transitions.
Okay. So yeah, I guess my question was how to really think about this when it's like an exogenous rate. I mean, part of the benefit of putting somebody on recall is I can bring them back like straight away. So as soon as things get better or policies change, I can just bring them straight back. But here I might still be waiting around.
Yeah, it's a modeling simplification. If I can answer, I mean, just to offer my perspective, we did this as a simplification. It's not the same as in Fujita and Moscarini. The difference is the firm has the choice when they have the furloughed worker. I think they call it something else, but anyway, that worker, they have the choice of recalling the worker at any point in time, which is we don't. Right now, you have to wait for that R shock to kick in, and really the difference that comes in is that the behavior of recall is a bit different when you have that endogenous versus exogenous. So what happens, for example, is if you see the labor market recovering, so you see job finding rates going up, your worry that the worker is going to run away to another job is higher, and so you rush to hire the worker back faster than you otherwise would in our model. And so to the extent that amplification is large enough, obviously that might affect the evaluation of the UI versus payroll subsidy policy. That's exactly the margin that we're missing, is that endogenous amplification in recall rates.
Right.
I mean, just to add to that, so even if the R component is exogenous, there is an endogenous decision that's made once the offer for recall is put on the table. Sure. Meaning to say, people could refuse that recall if suppose unemployment insurance is really high, and the surplus of going back to the job isn't enough. So in that sense, sort of these policies still do affect the outcome or recall rate outcome.
Okay, cool. Okay, thanks guys. So move it along. So next we have Randy Wright. So Randy, if you want to share your screen.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
The last time I shared my screen, the computer crashed. So let's click on it and see what happens. If I go away, it's not on purpose. Oh, looking good. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we got it.
I'm not even gonna do full screen because things are delicate. So as you can see this, I'm ready to proceed.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
So this is a paper written before the onset of the crisis. The old title was Toxic Assets and Market Freezes. Potentially a new title, given the situation, is Pandemics and Payments. And it's joined with the people you can see on the screen, sort of a committee of people. Now, first off, some language about the original title. What's a toxic asset? Well, we took a very serious source, Wikipedia. A toxic asset is a financial asset whose value has fallen significantly, which there is no longer a functioning market. So assets cannot be sold at a satisfactory price. And they talk about how the term became popular during the previous crisis, the financial crisis. When the market for toxic assets ceases to function, it's called frozen. And an even more serious source, Investopedia, mentions that toxic assets are assets that become illiquid when secondary markets disappear. So motivated by these ideas and some literature, we wanted to write a paper about freezes and over-the-counter markets. Now let me say, this is mainly an exercise in search theory, so highly appropriate to this forum. And I think we learned a lot from it. Hopefully I can communicate some of that. So the previous crisis motivates it as follows. Chu and Coppell and Ari Studd said that during the financial crisis, markets with centralized trading did fairly well. It was over-the-counter markets that froze. And they mentioned markets for mortgage-backed securities. But what we want to do is study over-the-counter market freezes. We want to see if they can come up with self-fulfilling prophecies. Let me say this has not really been done before, at least not satisfactorily, in my opinion. There is a lot of literature on hot and cold spells as self-fulfilling prophecies. So, you know, any sunspot equilibrium is going to describe a market where prices and quantities vary over time. But as far as I know, there's almost nothing done on having the market literally shut down and then reopen. We want to identify model features, which is why it's an exercise in search theory, that allow freezes. And we want to think about policies to help prevent or recover from market freezes. There were a lot of policies in the previous crisis, including purchases of certain assets. We want to think about that. Let me say that our goal here is to do this without fixed costs or other non-convexities. So a triviality would be to go back to Diamond 82 and say, the market is functioning, but one day people begin to believe that nobody else is going to go to the exchange sector. So if nobody else is going to go, you don't go. Now that doesn't actually work very well if you try to model it carefully. But moreover, if it has any hope, it has to be based on a fixed cost. And I'll come back to that later. But we think the challenge, at least for this paper, is to try to model markets opening and closing based on self-fulfilling prophecies without any kind of non-convexities. And I'll come back to how, even if you want to put non-convexities in there, it's quite subtle. How you do it affects the outcome. The main result here is that there exist equilibria where over-the-counter markets freeze, at least for some parameters, if and only if there are toxic assets in the economy. And these assets will be valued in equilibrium for their liquidity. So it's kind of a strong result. And let me describe to you in a minute or two how we go about deriving it. Let me also add, this is applications to labor economics, models of the retail sector, presumably housing and marriage markets, I don't know. But we're going to focus on asset markets. And in particular, this over-the-counter aspect is really important, as we discovered. Examples of toxic assets. So these are assets with a bad return, indeed a negative return. If you have equity in a firm with cost above revenue, not only temporarily, but permanently, that's certainly a toxic asset. Would it be valued in equilibrium? Not in Lorasian equilibrium, but in search theoretic equilibria, it turns out it can. I'll come back to that. It's common in asset pricing theory to refer to assets as trees. So equity was modeled following Lucas, or originally in Lucas. He didn't call it trees, but we think of them as trees bearing fruit as dividends. So let's pursue that parable. I don't know if you know about the ginkgo trees. Those are trees who have fruit, which is extremely poorly smelling, very stinky. That's kind of a little joke there. But that would be an example of negative, a toxic asset. And once again, could it be valued in equilibrium? Yeah, in markets with frictions, it may be. There are high salary, low productivity athletes, I put professors earlier, but a little too close to home, who have long-term contracts. So in sports, there are players with very high contracts. The team would like to trade them. Nobody wants them because they have basically cost above revenue. Now in search theory, in the literature, here are some maybe examples. All these examples are a bit fuzzy because I'm not sure they're good. I'm just throwing this out to see what people think. Inventories in papers following Rubenstein-Walensky in their search theoretic models of intermediation, those inventories are quote unquote toxic. They have a negative return. You have to pay a cost of storing inventories. Commodity money can have negative dividends, storage costs once again. Indeed, you can say vacancies in the Mortons and Pissarides model, they have a flow return which is negative. All these assets, inventories, vacancies, commodity monies are valued because eventually they can be sold or spent or filled. We're going to kind of work on that. Let me now turn to the pandemic, because this may well change how we perceive this project and market it. So an asset that many people, maybe not all of you guys, but someone's doing it, an asset that's perceived as toxic these days is cash. I don't know if you know about this. I didn't know. I thought it was not true. I thought the ink in paper currency and the acid in metal currency killed off germs, but it ain't true. A majority of US bills are contaminated by a long list of stuff, cocaine, yeast, mold, et cetera, et cetera. And it can carry nasty things like viruses that I can't even pronounce. Kind of interesting. Viruses and bacteria live on most surfaces for just a couple of days. Paper currency can transport the flu virus. It's been well documented for over 2 weeks, and some pathogens survive for months. So, you know, how people pay for stuff is, I'm going to argue, is kind of interesting and important. And money is just, it's a tricky payment instrument if people perceive it to be carrying germs or other potentially dangerous pathogens. Alternative payment mechanisms are available. I didn't know this either, but you know, look it up. In terms of germs, credit and debit cards are worse. Smartphones are worse. So how people pay is going to evolve in an interesting way. Here's just some facts. Payments Canada went out, and you can read these for yourself, but you know, no surprises. 75% of Canadians are spending less than pre-pandemic. No big deal. Just a word to everybody by way of footnote. I think home production is a critical component of a good model of the pandemic. People are not eating less, they're going out to restaurants less. People are not watching fewer movies, they're just going to theaters less and watching them at home. So home production is substituting for market activity. Home production is interesting. It typically requires no payment instrument. But anyway, 62% are using less cash when they do spend. 40% are using less checks. Checks are still a pretty big deal in Canada. They're not in the US. You can go down the list yourself. The very last one, 29% of people are tipping more. Kind of interesting. I'm not sure how it's relevant for this talk though. So here's a prognosis from Payments Canada. So cash and check have declined dramatically, being replaced with contactless and other form of e-payments. Now this is important. While we have seen a continued shift towards digital payments over a number of years, the pandemic has accelerated this and will act as a catalyst in transforming the payment landscape forever. Probably true. There's a strong element of hysteresis in payment instruments. You know, during a dollarization episode, people used to use pesos. Maybe it's costly to switch to dollars. Once they do, they typically do not switch back. Once we switch out of currency, we may never go back. And I have some claims there, which are, you know, I don't have a proof or even an argument. I just claim that monetary economics, which is an application of search theory, this is exactly our wheelhouse. We're supposed to study the way people buy and sell and pay for things. What things? Everything, including assets. And I also claim it has big consequences for efficiency and welfare. So there's a deal here in terms of the monetary aspect. It turns out that having fiat currency with the rate of return equal to 0 gives certain results. Using alternative assets with positive rates of return as payment instruments like Lucas trees changes some of the results in kind of a good way. It reduces the set of equilibria. Indeed, sometimes rendering the set of equilibria a singleton. So you can get rid of some multiplicities by using payment instrument with a positive return. If people perceive that currency has a negative return, which is that there's some probability you can get sick from handling it, well, the entire structure of the equilibrium set changes. And you'll see this in a couple of slides. So here's a standard off-the-shelf search model that some of us know quite well. The labor people sometimes don't know it that well, but it's a monetary version of a search model. A large number of infinite live buyers and sellers. Those labels will be described momentarily in more detail. This has alternating markets. One thing the monetary people do, which maybe the other people might want to consider, they integrate frictionless markets, as in GE theory, with search theoretic markets. And although there's alternative ways to do that, to me, the most natural and certainly the easiest that I know is to alternate them. So there's going to be a centralized market where, because I'm a macroeconomist, agents trade a consumption good, X, and labor. And they trade, in general, a portfolio of assets. This is a frictionless market, which is basically a clearinghouse for previous and future trades. It is a decentralized market where sellers want to sell something and buyers want to buy something. It doesn't matter for the formal theory whether these sellers and buyers are households trading goods, firms trading inputs, or financial institutions trading assets. The theory works pretty much the same. And there's also a financial market which captures the notion of over-the-counter. And as Chu and Kopel mentioned, over-the-counter markets behave differently in the previous crisis than more organized markets. And I'll describe these different markets in more detail using a timeline. Payoffs are kind of standard. There's utility from buyers and sellers from the centralized market, consumption good and labor. And there's also some payoff, U of Q, for buyers if they can acquire this other good or other object in the decentralized market. And a cost could be an opportunity cost or a production cost to the sellers to providing it. Now, the key to any work in payments is that you need to make something. So people have to have an asynchronization of payments and expenditures to make this interesting. And what's going to happen in this decentralized market, and sometimes the financial market, the buyers may want to or have an opportunity to make a purchase, but they have no current income to use. So they either have to use credit and pay off in the future, or assets brought into the period. And we're going to think mainly about assets serving as payment instruments here. Each asset pays a dividend, and its supply could grow. In particular, fiat currency pays no dividend. If it carries germs, it'll have a negative dividend. But fiat currency supply can grow. That's a policy instrument. If it's Lucas trees, we typically think of them as being in fixed supply. So here's a description of the full-blown model. A typical period. The order of these markets doesn't matter, but let me pursue this slide. There's a financial market where agents, this is the case with two assets in this diagram, they trade assets. Then there's a decentralized market where one of the assets, in this case A2, gets traded for this object Q, this other good or input. And finally, the centralized market, all assets are traded as well as labor and the consumption good, and you iterate on that. Now, for today's presentation, I'm going to do a simplified version. I'm going to consolidate the financial market and the decentralized market, where instead of trading, say, T-bills for cash and then using cash to buy goods, in the consolidated decentralized market, agents can trade the asset directly for the good. The results go through in the more general setting, and they're more interesting, in my opinion, because this financial market is a genuine over-the-counter market. If it's T-bills and currency, then it's a market where agents are buying and selling T-bills for cash, which is the way the real world works. It's over-the-counter because there are search-type frictions. You need to find a counterparty, and it's not well-raising pricing. So the simplified version with only two alternative markets is what I'll show you today. So the centralized market is you know, it's a textbook. As Lucas once said, all frictionless markets are the same. And this one's the same. There's a Walrasian budget equation. I moved my point. I don't know if you can see that, but in the budget equation, the wage is normalized to 1 without loss in generality. If you're holding the asset, you get the dividend, plus you can sell it at price fee. You may acquire new assets. I'm pursuing this with one asset for now. And then some lump sum taxes. And the standard results in this model, because I've specified it with quasi-linear utility, which is not the only assumption that works, but it's the most simple, we get that asset purchases are orthogonal to your wealth, and in particular to your current asset holdings. So this model is memoryless or history independent. because of the quasi-linearity, rich people will take more leisure, poor people will work harder, but conditional on their type, including preferences and technologies, etc. History doesn't matter for your portfolio decision. If you got a message that my internet connection is unstable, well, say la vie, let's forge ahead. So the DM terms of trade, I'm not going to show it to you, but basically in this over-the-counter market or in the consolidated market of assets for goods, we write it up as a generic mechanism which nests Walrasian pricing, Nash bargaining, strategic bargaining, and a lot of other things. So in this slide, let's look at that, the first couple of equations. This value of entering this decentralized market with some asset A hat is, well, you might just carry it through to the next centralized market, but with the rival rate alpha, you have a trading opportunity. And if you're a buyer, you make a trade. U of Q is your payoff from acquiring Q units of this object. V of Q is the amount you have to pay in assets. This is the simplified version after much work. And then the second line simply substitutes in the first order conditions. So I'm not going to dwell on this for interest of time. If you grind out the Euler equation, you get an equilibrium asset pricing equation, which is almost standard. It's almost textbook. The price of an asset at day T is its discounted payoff, which is the dividend plus the resale value, times 1 if it's textbook. But if it's a search theoretic model where assets are valued as payment instruments with probability alpha, L is the liquidity premium. It's the amount you value an asset in excess of its standard return because it may be useful in facilitating exchange. And in fact, the simplest interpretation of L, it's the Lagrange multiplier on a payment constraint. So a payment constraint would be you cannot transfer more assets than you currently have. We can allow some credit, but at the margin, assets are useful. And then the second line, it tends to be convenient to describe the system, not in terms of the price, but in terms of the value. So Z is the value of the asset at day T. It's basically the dividend plus the resale value. And when you redo this, you get, let's call it Z liquidity, because that's what it is. But I'm handing the asset over to you in exchange for something. Z is how much you'll give me for it, or it's the value of the asset in the exchange, which then translates into how much you give me. And there's some constant here, rho A, plus some term where Z enters in the numerator of this fraction, and then Z enters inside the square brackets. That's a highly nonlinear object. And let's define it to be f of zt plus 1. So similar to most good stuff in finance or monetary economics, the equilibrium in this system is a sequence of values for Z, liquidity, that satisfy this difference equation. The sequence must be bounded for reasons having to do with the transversality condition. And the sequence must be non-negative, of course. So it's a forward-looking system because in general, the value of any asset today depends on what it will be tomorrow. There's 3 leading cases we're going to study. Fiat currency, which has no return, rho equals 0, but the supply could vary over time as a policy variable. Second, we'll consider nice trees. So Lucas trees that will keep the supply fixed and will allow a positive rate of return or a dividend from the asset. And finally, bad trees like the poor ginkgo tree that have a negative flow value, again, keeping the supply fixed. In all of these cases, these are parameter restrictions necessary for the existence of a stationary equilibrium. So to keep the environment stationary, you want the supply of real assets to be fixed. With fiat currency, you can have the supply of nominal assets vary over time because if its value goes down, real balances could be constant. Now note, here is something actually I never knew, and this is critical to understanding the nature of equilibria in a large class of models, but in this class in particular. I thought that having a negative return, like maybe the asset carries the virus, would be equivalent to having inflation. Both reduce its rate of return, but it's just not the case. Inflation induced by growth in the money supply, following the quantity theory, shows up as a change in the slope of this dynamical system, mu is in the denominator of that fraction. Having a negative rate of return, like nasty ginkgo trees, or currency that could infect you, shows up as an intercept in this equation. And you may think, well, what a triviality, intercept versus slope. No, man, it changes everything. Let me show you how. So here's the case of using Lucas trees as a payment instrument. If I meet you in this over-the-counter market and I want you to give me something or do something for me, I must turn over some of these trees. Well, it turns out it has a stationary equilibrium, and indeed you can prove with some work it's unique. And you can see it as Z sub S. It is a solution to this dynamical system, or a steady state of the system F, and it's a constant solution. There are no other solutions that remain unbounded or non-negative. If you trace out from any initial condition other than Z sub S, you'll go to negative values or go to infinity, and that can't be equilibrium. This is a nice example where with the standard asset, there's a unique steady state and also a unique equilibrium. Fiat currency is a little different because the intercept is 0. So this F goes through the origin, and then it turns out there's bounded sequences going from the steady state where Z equals ZS down to the origin. There could also be more exotic outcomes like cycles and chaotic dynamics. Now, all of a sudden, my world changed because with a toxic asset, a bad tree, or, I mean, in a more elaborate narrative, claims that mortgage-backed securities, but we haven't modeled that particularly realistically, the intercept of this system is negative. You can see the origin in this picture is here, if you can see my pointer. This is a whole different world. For one thing, there's two steady states, potentially. If the intercept is negative enough, there does not exist an equilibrium where this asset is valued. If the intercept is not too low, so the dividend is negative but not too big an absolute value, there's two positive steady states. And in particular, there's a steady state where this system F cuts the 45-degree line from below. Mathematically, that changes the entire nature of the equilibrium set, and in a very interesting way from the search theoretic perspective. These different regions down here are in different colors, will come up in the statement of theorems below. But I want you to look at this picture, and importantly, this dynamical system is mathematically different from the standard case of Lucas trees or even fiat currency. It's because of the steady state, which is stable in the sense that F cuts the 45-degree line from below. With fiat currency, the origin is stable, but you can't move around the origin because Z can't go negative. Here we got some wiggle room. So we're going to model market freezes as sunspot equilibria. As I said, I wanted to think about self-fulfilling prophecies. What is standard in the literature is to pursue what we call intensive sunspot equilibria. This decentralized search and bargaining market, or in much of the literature, the Walrasian market, is always active, but the price and trade volume could fluctuate with the state. So this dynamical system now has its two equations in two unknowns, the unknowns being a sequence, but for a two-state version, it's really just two equations in two real numbers, Z1 and Z2. So if you're not aware, the sunspot idea is there's a random variable that everybody can see, but it is intrinsically irrelevant. It has no impact on preferences or technology or the matching function or anything else. But if agents believe it could affect behavior, then it could end up as a self-fulfilling prophecy in principle. And there's a long literature in the old days, mainly at the University of Pennsylvania, seeing if and when this could be a possible equilibrium outcome. So in one state of the world, the sunspot state 1, there's an asset pricing equation. But on the right-hand side, there's some probability of staying in state 1 and some probability of switching to state 2. In state 2, there's an asset pricing equation with some probability of staying and some probability of switching. These probabilities, we can take them to be whatever we want because we're trying to construct an equilibrium. So we make up probabilities. such that the endogenous variables Z1 and Z2 satisfy these two equations, but Z1 is not equal to Z2. And of course, we need them both to be non-negative to make it a legitimate equilibrium. There's the literature on that, and it's fascinating. An extensive sunspot equilibrium, there's virtually no literature on that. Instead of having hot and cold markets, we went this over-the-counter trading environment to literally freeze and thaw. So in state Z1, in this asset pricing equation, there's no liquidity term because the asset is not trading. People believe that the decentralized market is going to be inactive. Now in the multiple asset version, the decentralized market is still active, but this asset will not trade. So it has no liquidity term. In the second term, if we switch to the other state, all of a sudden the liquidity reemerges and the asset starts trading, and the liquidity component is seen here. And in the liquid state, if we do not switch, there's a liquidity component once again. If we do switch to the freeze, the market seizes up, then the asset is valued, but only in terms of its fundamental, not in terms of its liquidity. So we seek a solution to this system where these conditions are satisfied. First off, Z2 has to be positive. The asset has to be valued. Now we actually want Z1 to be negative. So the asset cannot trade. If I offer you the asset in exchange for something in the over-the-counter market, you don't want it. However, the negative current value is greater than the dividend. Remember, for a toxic asset, rho is negative. So Z1 is negative. The asset currently has a low value, but I'm going to hold on to it. Because even though I can't trade it in the decentralized market, if the market thaws next period, the asset will blip up in value. So I'm speculating on the asset value jumping. Hence, I'm willing to hold it, but I can't trade it. Now, what makes this work is an important assumption. If I were to freely dispose of this asset, I'm still on the hook for A times rho. So you could throw the asset away, but within the period, you still suffer the consequences of holding it. If you burn your money, you could still get sick from it. If you shut down your firm, limited liability is not assumed here, so you're still on the hook for your operating costs, etc. And we need that to make this thing work. For the market to freeze, it has to be that the asset has value which is negative, so it can't be traded, but the value is not so negative. In particular, it's above the asset supply times its negative dividend, so people do not want to dispose of the asset. And mathematically, we're trying to solve this equation system subject to these restrictions. You can see already it requires a toxic asset. For Z1 to not trade, for the asset to not trade, Z1 must be negative. But to have it not thrown away, it must be bigger than A. We can normalize A to 1. It must be bigger than rho. So if rho is positive, it ain't going to happen. The question is, if rho is negative, might it happen? Well, let me show you this dynamical system. In the previous diagram, this was rather mundane. It's monotone. This need not be monotone. Here's an example where this dynamical system is non-monotone, and indeed, its slope becomes negative and it crosses the 45-degree line with a slope less than -1, which, if you want to calibrate this up, requires risk aversion around 5 or 6, which is not outrageous. And we can see, in addition to the steady state, there's a intensive sunspot equilibrium. This is a textbook result where Z fluctuates between these 2 points where F and its inverse cross off the 45-degree line. So that's old news. Now with intensive sunspot equilibria, so we're going to continue to pursue the case where the market doesn't freeze, but there are hot and cold spells. We get a somewhat new result. We still get exactly the same phenomena occurring around the high steady state. But if you look down here around the low steady state, well, there's another steady state, and because the dynamical system is stable here, you can construct lots of sunspot equilibria around that steady state. That's only somewhat new because in terms of substance, the results are standard, even though the mathematics is a bit different. If you want to think about diamond 82, this F system is what he draws, he's able to get multiple steady states, and in further work, people get dynamics if and only if there's increasing returns in the meeting technology, which is the non-convexity. He also requires essentially a fixed cost of participating. We're proceeding with no fixed costs or other non-convexities here. Now here's the very new result. The diagram is what it is. It's not that interesting, but let me just note there are different regions here which will delineate certain sets of values of Z. And here are some formal propositions. So let me go to proposition 1. This is for a Lucas tree, which could have a positive or negative return, but its supply is fixed. It's understood from past literature there exist intensive sunspot equilibria, blah, blah, blah. And if rho happens to be negative, well, we can construct lots of intensive sunspot equilibria. For fiat money and any policy in terms of monetary growth, such that monetary equilibrium exists, you can get intensive sunspot equilibrium. You cannot get a market freeze. There are no extensive sunspot equilibria. For a Lucas tree with any rho, so this should have been clear from what I said before, if it's a Lucas tree with a positive return, there are no sunspot equilibria. So combining the previous proposition in the first part of this one with Lucas trees and fiat currency, there are no market freezes. If rho is negative, there exists market freezes for any values of Z1 and Z2. So the two values the asset takes in different states, and it fluctuates between them, where Z1 and Z2 belong to this green interval, if you can see my slide and my marker, and the blue interval. The intuition here is in the frozen state, A is illiquid because rho plus phi is negative. So sellers don't want it and they will not produce or trade in exchange for it in this over-the-counter market. Asset holders get a negative return, but the price of the asset is still positive, which means if you have it, you're willing to hold on to it even though you can't trade it. You're going to wait for a thaw. You're going to eat the loss associated with negative rho, and then the liquidity will reemerge. In the context of the pandemic, some vendors are not going to accept currency at all. But people holding it will continue to hold it and not burn it because they're thinking that if this was a self-fulfilling prophecy, we could switch back to the liquid state where currency starts circulating again. Now, that's the baseline results. Did I do it? Yeah, I did everything intuition. So we can construct market freezes. Let me say there's some papers, Chu and Coppell in particular, do it with private information. We have no private information, and for now, no non-convexities. I'll talk about non-convexities. I won't talk about private information. So extensions and applications, we could do it with multiple assets. So if you have two assets, asset one and asset two, one could be fiat currency. It could be two fiat currencies, dollars and pesos. It could be two types of Lucas trees, T-bills and equity. If both have positive, yep.
Randy, I just realized I totally lost track of time, but I'll give you like another 2 minutes and then we'll go to questions.
I'm wrapping up. These are my concluding slides.
Perfect, thanks.
In the frozen state, one of the assets is illiquid. The OTC market doesn't shut down. Other assets are traded. A quick comment on if one of the assets is fiat money and the other one is potentially toxic. Good monetary policy eliminates the possibility of a freeze. In particular, run the Friedman rule. You satiate the economy in liquidity and nobody needs to use toxic assets. So this stuff here about money, people perceive that money is dirty. This could encourage a switch to alternative payment instruments, which was happening slowly over time anyway, but it could accelerate the process. And if once we stop using cash, we're probably never going to go back. Huge implications for monetary policy. Okay, non-convex economies. You could do it with a fixed cost of using credit, fixed entry costs, etc. This is pretty interesting. The cost must be sunk before buyers and sellers meet. So for example, a fixed cost of production doesn't work. I don't have time to get into the details, but it doesn't work. It has to be fixed. Moreover, if it's a fixed cost of entry, which is sunk, you need an OTC market. If it was Warasian, the following thing would happen. There's a big fixed cost. So that means only a small number of sellers will go to the market, but these sellers can satisfy lots of buyers, and this fixed cost is dissipated across many sellers. So only a small number of sellers enter, and they pay the fixed cost, but they have big profits because they're serving many clients. That is to say, the prices are high, and they get a profit that meets their fixed cost. It doesn't work in over-the-counter market because by assumption, each seller is limited to trade bilaterally, so with one buyer, and there's no way to dissipate this fixed cost. You know, if the seller can only sell to one buyer, well, he's not going to make enough to cover his entry cost. So you can do it with non-convexities, but it's interesting that it's subtle and it requires an over-the-counter market. It doesn't work in a centralized market. So I'm kind of done. If anybody has any comments or questions, that's cool. Well, let me say one final thing. I like the last bullet point. Search theory is the right way to study how people pay, obviously, because it models agents trading with each other, not simply with their budget line. It's also the right way to study pandemics in general. We saw the previous paper and many other papers recently. You almost have to use search theory to study, the transmission of disease. As it says in the final bullet point, no one ever got sick or injured sliding down their budget line. You might get sick or injured trading with a counterparty. So I'm done. That's
great. Thanks, Randy. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I had a quick question. I kind of want to come back to something you mentioned in the introduction about how you would kind of think of this as applied to labor markets, potentially with a vacancy being a asset which has, is it a vacancy which would have a negative
a vacancy at the cost, a negative return, but you're paying to keep the vacancy open until you fill it.
Right. So I was kind of having, I don't know whether Guido wants to chip in here. I was having a little chat with Guido in the chat regarding like how this might relate to his paper with Greg, where there's kind of the element of you're trying to figure out whether to post the vacancy, not knowing what its value is going to be once it's filled in the next period. I don't know how related the two are.
I can let Guido chip in, although that paper with Greg is actually a spin-off of my paper with Guido in the AER, which they didn't reference for some reason. Guido can chime in on that too if he cares to. But, I think you can get results like this with market freezes with a fixed cost. The challenge for us here was to try to do it without a fixed cost. So for labor economics, a fixed cost is natural.
Right, of course.
For markets, it may be less natural. Sorry, for asset markets and goods markets, it may be less natural.
Yeah. Guido, did you have anything you wanted to?
But besides apologizing again to Randy, citing our own paper, I think there are some differences. Not clear how the mapping would work. So one thing is that typically in the modern simplicity model, we don't think as the vacancy as an asset. In fact, it's just a flow maintenance cost.
Right. That
can be shut down and reopened. So that's the first difference. The second difference is once you do think of the vacancy as an asset, then you may naturally want to let it be traded in some secondary market. At that point, I think the analysis would carry through. We could construct, in principle, freezes and thaws on the vacancies. Right. Where the market for vacancies shuts down, there is no further production of vacancies, and then it may open up again.
Okay. Let's see. I guess Randy went a little bit over, and that was probably my bad for not being on time. But I'm not sure if we've got any other questions. I don't know, Randy. You've got another couple of minutes if you wanted to add anything else, or Guido.
I mean, I'm happy to move on to the next paper. I think I said what I wanted to say.
Okay. Cool. All right. In that case, let's move on to, well, I guess either Francesco or Fernando, whichever whichever one of you guys is presenting now.
Yeah, I think it's me, Simon.
Okay.
Francesco.